welcome to VistaTalks, interesting discussions with interesting people from all around the world. I am your host for today, Maria Roa, and I am delighted to be joined by Sharon O'Brien. Sharon is the Associate Dean for Research in the Faculty of Humanities and Social Science at Dublin City University. She is responsible for implementing the research strategy and lecture in translation technology, localization, crisis translation, and research methodologies. Sharon's research interests lie mainly in the cognitive aspects of interaction with translation technologies, like machine translation. More recently, she has led research on the role of translation in crisis settings, which is something I really want to talk with you about today. Sharon, you're very welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Maria.
It is a pleasure to meet you again. Last time we saw each other was at Gala.
That's right.
Yeah, you did a presentation about multilingual communication for resilience building. It was great. I thought it was extremely interesting how you express the importance that translation plays in a crisis response. Let's start with that. What do you think it's the potential for intra, and multimodal translation as a resilience building tool?
Yeah, thanks very much, Maria. I really enjoyed doing that presentation at Gala, actually. Yeah, so the potential, I think, is enormous, mainly because the potential for translation in crisis response hasn't always been tapped. And generally, I think translation has been overlooked as a really important tool for crisis response. By translation, of course, when I say translation, I mean translation and interpreting. So when we think about crisis response, we often think just about interpreting, but the written act also plays a really important role. So we've seen, for example, through the pandemic that translation was really, really important to make sure that people who were in a particular jurisdiction who maybe didn't understand the language or didn't speak it very well had the right information so that they could protect themselves and their families. So this has kind of helped to showcase why translation is really important in crisis response. But generally, we think about it in terms of just the response stage of a crisis. And in disasters and crises, there are many other stages like recovery, and then mitigation and preparedness for when a new crisis or a new disaster hits. And I suppose one of the things that we've been doing is trying to make sure that people understand that translation plays a really important role in those stages as well. So, in a recovery after an earthquake, for example, there might be a lot of information that needs to be translated, which this tends to be forgotten about. But then in terms of resilience, the stages of mitigation and preparation for crisis, this is where translation can really come into its own as a resilience building tool. So where people are being informed about what you need to do to prepare for crisis, to be ready, to make sure that you and your loved ones around you are resilient to crisis. That kind of information is often just broadcast in whatever language or official language that the country speaks. And we tend to forget about the fact that there are lots of people who maybe don't speak that language or have limited capacity in it, and we don't really translate for those people. So in terms of using translation as a resilience building tool, there's huge potential there, which, as I said, is untapped so far in many parts of the world.
Yeah, it is amazing. I think we talked about this before your presentation, but whenever this happened, there was like a big earthquake, and I remember the Spanish firefighters were there. It was Turkey, I believe.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and they were taking this little kid out of the rooms. Yeah, out of the rooms, and that little kid was super scared, didn't know what was happening, and these Spanish firefighters obviously didn't know Turkish, and there was a translator there who was telling the kid like not to move, like what to do, like because they needed to take him as safe as possible, and they didn't need him to move because otherwise things could fall down on his head or whatever. Yeah. And that guy was there helping this kid. I mean, I thought it was like whatever that translator, what that translator was doing was super important, as important as what the firefighters were doing.
Absolutely, especially in the case of a young kid, for example, who's probably or possibly just lost their family. If
Yes.
they caught in that, so this is a horrendous situation to be in, and to have people there trying to help you, but speaking a language that you simply don't understand, and all of the trauma that goes with just being in an earthquake, but then not being able to understand what people are saying to you. It's just, that story just brings it all home, how important translation is in these.
Having that person there was basic. It was so needy. It was perfect.
Yeah.
It make everything come together. I think
exactly. It at least, I think, reduces the trauma perhaps that's being felt by the person who's involved. It doesn't make things easier necessarily when the bigger picture is considered, but it at least takes away the communication barrier.
Yes, that kid probably didn't even know what happened to him at that moment. If he only hears like voices of people that he doesn't understand, I mean, that shock could have been even bigger if he hears like a voice, a language that he understands, that is telling him to calm down. Don't worry, we're here. We're going to help you. We're going to take you out. Just do this, do that,
Yeah.
I mean, probably that really did help him. I mean, not probably, I'm sure 100% that did
For
help.
sure. And even if it's not a kid, like I think our capacity to react in a disaster is very, very limited, because, the fear kicks in and you just want to protect yourself. So your ability to think rationally is, of course, in some way compromised even as an adult. So just having really clear communication is important, but communication in a language that you can understand as well. So, yeah, so I think translation plays such a crucial role. And as I've said before, we haven't really paid a whole lot of attention to that. So we're really trying to raise awareness of why it's essential.
Yeah, thank you for that, because it is really important, even if we didn't notice before. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
So let's change into machine translation, which, as we spoke about, it's something that you're very much into it. I know you've undertaken a specific research program in human factors in machine translation for many years.
Yes.
Could you tell us more about it?
Yeah, so I suppose I started off many years ago being interested in post-editing, and strangely, at a time when nobody was actually really post-editing. This was a gut feeling I had that machine translation might be about to come into its own. I don't really know why I thought that, but it just looked like there was, increasing interest in it after years of stagnation, because MT looked like it was going nowhere. And so I was very interested in post-editing, because the assumption was that with machine translation plus post-editing, you can go faster, produce, still high quality translation. So for me, the interesting part was the human part. So what impact would this have on the translator from a cognitive perspective? Is it really easier, or is it not easier to post-edit machine translation output? And those were some of the questions that I tried to tackle in the sort of early stages of my research career. At a time when we were still actually working with rules-based machine translation, just moving towards the statistical approach to machine translation. And of course, that was a game changer. So then we saw MT being deployed more and more in localization, which is always an early adopter type industry, primarily. And again, I was really interested there in like, well, what impact is this going to have on the human translator? Clearly there was going to be resistance, and that resistance has prevailed for many years. I think with NMT, possibly we've gotten over a little bit of the bump of resistance, in that the tools are now producing something that's much more tolerable from a human processing perspective. But still there's resistance, and I think it's really interesting to investigate the sort of human machine resistance and relationship, because it's more than just stubborn translators. It's really all about, you know, our identities as humans and machines suddenly doing things that we only ever did ourselves. So I think that the human factor question is so important. And I think it's where I would say machine translation development and implementation has failed to some extent, because the approach has always been, let's crack this from a computational perspective. This is a computational problem. Let's try and make the MT output better and better and better. Okay, so you get to a point where it looks quite good and it wouldn't take much to edit it to make it acceptable quality. Okay, here you go, use this. And this is where you meet the brick wall, because the people you're telling to use the technology, they're going, no, oh no, I like the way I do things. I don't like that output. It makes me behave differently to what I'm used to doing for 10, 15, 20 years. You're telling me I have to go faster, you're going to pay me less for it. And then you get the no way kind of response to that. And of course, then the industry says, well, if you don't do it, we'll find somebody else who does it. And, you know, so there's a lot of contention there, I suppose, between people, clients, suppliers, and so on. I think this is really fascinating. And, you know, for me, I think the rollout of MT has been faulty. And the main thing is that they didn't consider the people who were going to have to use the output from the very beginning. And they didn't involve them in discussions about how this would serve their purposes and their processes, rather than just serving the industry, if you like. So that's my perspective on it. And I think that's, you know, that's what I like to investigate.
Yeah, I think you're right in a way of saying that we did have a fault in the way we introduced machines into the life of humans. Let's say we sold it, or the marketing that we did around machines is like, this is so much faster and cheaper. So we are not going to need the people. And that was the biggest mistake from the beginning. We are always going to need the people. They're just going to do different jobs in order to help machines to work better. But we will always need the people, or that's what I believe. It's just like our roles will change, and they will change in order to make machines work better, because we will always need the people. And that's how everything should have been presented from the beginning, because it wasn't. There is a big crash between the way machines and humans work, or they have to work. So yeah, there's a big a big dilemma there.
Yeah, I think there are important lessons to learn from, you know, it's really human computer interaction in general, which is, if you want to create a tool or a technology to assist with a human process, you need to involve the humans who are the experts in that process. And from the beginning, like, so what do you need in your process? That's what's difficult that could be solved by a machine, that won't make you feel less important, or like you're just feeding the machine, as opposed to the machine is helping you do a job better. So I think there's definitely a move towards that, and recognizing that AI can take away some of the tedious jobs of translation and free people up to do the more creative, you know, and interesting jobs. But that conversation, I think, didn't really happen in the beginning. So hence the resistance.
So to what extent do you think machine translation can augment human cognition and our ability to translate?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question as well. Obviously, we all know, or maybe we don't want to recognize this, but our cognitive abilities are quite limited. You know, so you forget where you left your glasses, or, you know, all these things happen, and you go, oh yeah, my brain is actually limited in terms of how much information it can hold at any one point in time. Whereas obviously machines and databases do a much better job at those kind of things. So for sure, we could look at AI and machine translation specifically as a way of augmenting our abilities in the translation world. This is, I think, still a very open question as to how we could and how we should do this. So I'm really hoping we don't make the same mistakes that we made with rolling out machine translation by saying, okay, now AI is going to do this, here you go, you're not doing that anymore. So we do need this consultation. And when we talk about augmentation, I think sometimes we don't quite understand what we're actually talking about. So there are lots of different I suppose, examples, research studies on how to augment human cognition that we could learn from in the world of translation. This would mean using tools to be able to identify, say, when a translator is tired, confused, frustrated, and needs assistance from an AI entity. And then having a tested mechanism so that the right kind of solution is then provided to the translator who's maybe confused about something. So to put that in more concrete terms, let's say I can tell from eye tracking or from heart rate that when this translator is reading the sentence and they're having to reread it and reread it, that they're confused about the meaning of the sentence, right? So now I know that when I have these indicators that the translator is confused, I can offer this type of solution or that type of solution or a third kind of solution. And I learn then from the translator which of those types of solutions are better for that particular person. And so what you have there is, like, first of all, being able to identify when we're confused or frustrated, offering solutions that are helpful or useful, and learning from the person as to which of those solutions actually works for them. So it's kind of like a personalization or personalized AI augmentation that's going on. So those are the ideas. And that's way more sophisticated and also way more challenging than what we are calling augmentation at the moment, which is generally, let's create more tools and give them to the translator so they can go faster. For me, that's not real augmentation. That's just throwing tools at people.
Yeah, so we still need to go a lot more deep into what we have right now.
I think so. And I think this sounds like, you know, science fiction at this point in time, but I think that we do have now tools and technologies on our desktops that will allow us to determine if someone is confused or frustrated or tired through keyboards, through cameras with eye tracking, through just, you know, sensory responses to things. So these things exist. And could be used to identify when someone needs a bit of augmentation for their cognitive abilities. Of course, it raises lots of questions around ethics. You know, should you be tracking somebody's cognitive states in that way? Do they, you know, they have to give permission for that? Who's collecting that information? So there's lots of really difficult ethical questions that come with all of this. But the science is there, I think, that would allow us to apply it to translation for augmentation.
Wow, it does sound like science fiction, you're right.
It does.
But everything can happen nowadays, so you never know.
This is it, and it happens so quickly.
It does. It does. I would have never imagined this like in the 1990s. I can tell you what we have right now in the 1990s, when I was like, I'm going to say very old, like, I mean, sorry, very young.
Really young.
Yeah, indeed, very young. So after all we've talked about machine translation, do you think it is good enough for specialized professional use? Or do we still have a lot to go? Like,
yeah, so it's always dangerous, I think, to generalize about machine translation. So I would say that it is good enough for sure, but it really depends on several things and the context, I think, mainly. So if you're talking about an MT system that has been trained on highly domain-specific, specialized text, that's obviously been checked for its quality, that there's sufficient amount of data and it's applied in a, sensible manner, then absolutely, we're there with a lot of machine translation systems. But if you're talking about like a system that's trained on sparse data for languages that don't have a lot of data, that, maybe the data is not particularly appropriate to the context, or it's full of errors, of course, then it's going to produce output that's not usable or that's not so helpful. So I think it really always comes down to the quality of the engine and how appropriate it is for the particular context. But we are able now, I think, to produce engines that are actually very appropriate and trained on appropriate materials, such that they are really quite useful in professional contexts. So it's just really, let's do more of that, I think.
What about the languages? Is that important too? Because, for example, in Spanish, we do have like some problems with the gender use, like the things, because our things have gender. It's not only the people who have gender, like even the streets have gender. So depending on the street you live in, it might be like a female street or a male street. So whenever you give directions, it might be to like a female street. So that's quite complicated. And like I have to say, I tried a few machine translation tools, and that's very complicated. The same thing with like reading Roman numbers or like translating Roman numbers or stuff like that. It's quite complicated.
Yeah, I think we haven't cracked that completely for sure, especially with languages with gender and high inflection and so on. But we've certainly made a lot of progress on that. It used to be, quite problematic, and now I think it's less problematic. What is maybe more challenging is our own use of language, and gender is changing.
Oh yeah, that's the other thing. Yes.
So it's quite possible that we make mistakes on that now. And so the machines will continue to make mistakes on that too, because there isn't sufficient data to learn what gender you might use in what context. And of course, that's one of the big issues that gets called out again and again, is the bias of output from machine translation systems, which is always interesting to me when people talk about this, because we tend to forget that bias is learned or encoded in the data that we created. So, so we need to find ways around overcoming the bias in the data that's used to train the engines.
Yes.
It's evolving. The use of gender in language is evolving also. So that's going to be interesting. I don't think we've cracked that problem yet, because our own use of it is moving.
Yeah, the world goes too fast for the machines to go up with us. I mean, it never. Yeah, we go faster than they go. But yeah, that's why people are there for it, to also to check everything that the machine is doing and to make sure that everything it's working.
That's it. And I think, we talk about the importance of the human in the whole process. So not forgetting that maybe there is value there for a human to do that. A big question is whether people want to do that kind of a job. Do they want to be the checker to make sure that the machine hasn't made a serious error? I'm wondering who wants to do those kind of jobs, but if they're paid well enough, maybe, but who knows?
Let's see. That's the future, I guess.
Yeah.
So let's change from MT to AI. Nowadays, we have a new reality, and that's the content created by artificial intelligence. What impact do you feel this will have in the localization industry?
Yeah, so I really don't know, I suppose, is the honest answer. I can imagine there are going to be some interesting implications if people start to, which they have already, to generate text via AI. I suppose, there are two sides to this. So on the one hand, maybe the content generated might be actually better source text for translation. Now, why do I say that? Because AI can be used to correct grammar, to rephrase things in a way that maybe it conforms to a specific kind of voice that you wanted to conform to, or a particular register. You can change like spelling, and these are things that can be done really quickly and really easily these days with AI. So there's a possibility that actually the text that goes to translation might be even clearer than the text sometimes that a human might create. And it's certainly one of the things that professional translators comment on a lot when they're trying to translate, like that the source text is poor quality. Mm-hmm. So maybe AI will actually help fix that problem. But then we know on the other side that it tends to create fallacies, to hallucinate, to create things and suggest them as facts when they're not actually facts. So we could have situations where source text is incorrect factually. So that's going to have significant ramifications for translation. And then, of course, there's that question that we just talked about, where what it's producing is based on learning from a set of data, which is a subset of data. So it can only maybe reproduce a certain limited type of idea, whereas human creativity is at the moment, I think, much greater. So maybe you're getting limited, biased, leaning in one direction type of text. So there are all sorts of really interesting questions there. But on the one hand, I think we shouldn't say it's all bad. So maybe these tools could be used for good purposes for translation and localization in general. Certainly, if I bring it back to the university environment that I work in, of course, ChatGPT has been a major topic of discussion recently. If you talk to the students about how they're using it, the clever ones are using it as a primer. So as a way of generating ideas for essays, which they then go off and build on or write themselves. The not so clever students are using it as a de facto text production tool. So create my essay and then hand it in. And of course, it's fairly easy at the moment to identify the ones that have just come from AI. But using it to generate ideas that you can then build on is just another tool in that case. And, maybe in the localization sector can be used in that way as well, as a kind of a creativity tool that is then built on using other skill sets from other tools, other human beings. So yeah, lots of open questions there, I think, about how this is going to impact the industry.
No, I do believe it could be used for many things. Like you said, like not only giving ideas, but like when you need a list of things or like the best something, or like, I mean, you can use it for many things, but writing itself, localization content is specific to a city, a country. For me right now, that would mean the same thing we were talking before, like someone would have to look it over, and then you have like a human checking again the content, and would they want to do that? Do we want that? Would it be an expensive job? I mean, yeah.
It's a good question, because I mean, often, the response is, well, it's okay, but I wouldn't say it that way. And so the question is, what's the value of having a human being look at something and saying, it's okay, but I wouldn't say it that way. So it depends on what you're trying to do with the text, I suppose. If you're looking for something that's just okay, that's fine. If you're looking for something that's really on brand, really, you know.
I wouldn't do something okay without checking anyways.
Yeah.
What about if the whole, like all the information, 100% of the information is not, as you said, like real? Is just like something that the chat GPT got from like a website and it wasn't checked,
Yeah.
or it's not 100% truth? Maybe you're, I don't know. You want
That-
that as your content.
Exactly. And then you're getting into reputational issues, but you're also possibly getting into legal ramifications if you're publishing something that's completely incorrect. So yeah, I guess
It is great for some things, as you said, for giving ideas. I think it is great that you can always check them and make sure, yeah, this would be great. And you can write your own papers. But writing the whole thing right now, content-wise,
yeah,
I would trust it 100%.
no,
If I could check it, then fine. But we're at the same point than before. We need a human to check.
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So your students are using it for papers. I mean, this didn't happen when I was a student.
No, and this is really, you know, it's the last academic year where this has come to the fore, obviously since ChatGPT was launched in particular, and universities around the world are, of course, scrambling to try to deal with this, and how should we deal with it? Because, you know, you can't just change your rules and regulations either in the middle of an academic session. In Australia, I believe some universities went immediately back to exam hall only assessment, where you just went into the exam hall like a normal person did in the 70s and 80s, and you wrote for 2 to 3 hours. But there's not an appetite for that. I know the world has moved on and we value other kinds of learning and other kinds of assessment. So it's really trying to find a balance between allowing students to use tools and discussing it with them, you know, how they could or should use it, but what's okay and what's not okay if you want to assess their learning. So these are debates that are raging.
They're learning to use the tools. So maybe those are the people of the future, the ones that we need.
That's right. So many of them will go on and use these kind of tools. So really the education is around how to use it appropriately. And, you know, obviously plagiarism is one of our big concerns. So, no, not using it and passing it off as your own work only, but recognizing or acknowledging the process. And then, you know, you get into discussions about, well, what about a spelling checker? What about a grammar checker? And, you know, where do the lines end and so on. So there, it's really fascinating.
Yeah, it goes on and on.
Yeah.
But we're almost at the end of the show. And before we go, I would like to ask you something about another topic you presented in Gala. It was the language engineer. You were talking about that person, a transversal emerging role for the automation age. And I thought it was super interesting. Could you tell us a bit more about what are the skills of this new role you were presenting at the event? What does it make it unique? Why the localization industry need a language engineer? Is this the new person that we're talking about that is going to be like helping the machines work better, or like, what is it? Tell us about it.
Yeah, so good question. What is it? So this is work I've done with Vicente Briva Iglesias, who's my PhD student at the moment, and he's also worked in localization himself, so he's quite close to the sector. And we both agree that this idea of, you know, the old version of the translator and the localization engineer as two separate people perhaps needs to be revisited, especially because we're hearing a lot of discussion of how AI is going to maybe replace or change the role of the translator. So this touches, of course, very closely on what we do in the education sector, because we want to make sure that our graduates are employable and they have the skill sets. And of course, it's still really a place for excellent linguists and excellent translators. But we also think that specifically for localization, we want to train people who kind of can cross over that line that wasn't usually crossed over into the more engineering kind of roles. Whereas typically, you have the translator who does their work, you have the engineer who possibly doesn't know a whole lot about translation. But if you allow these skill sets to merge, you've got probably somebody who's got like a really excellent profile that's very suitable for localization. And it also gives them, a better future-proof kind of career path, I think. So we're talking about people who are not afraid of machine translation, who are computationally quite good, not necessarily excellent programmers, but who know something about programming, who know about data, machine learning, data annotation. But also, like, going back to what we just talked about, maybe there are roles for our typical students, maybe there are roles for them in content creation, because they're excellent with language. So I've always thought that we're wasting their skills because they could also be creating content for localization, or getting into trans creation. And so looking at a brief and, creating a new marketing or ad campaign in a target language or a target culture. So it's kind of trying to pull on all of those areas where there are human skills really required, and ensuring that we are trying to train our students with those skills so that they can, I suppose, live through the next 10 years really and have good careers. That's the goal.
So can we say that the new students coming out from DCU are going to be language engineers?
Yeah, I think they can easily pitch themselves in that way, and several of them have done so. So, they may end up also doing the traditional roles like translation or language technology management or project management, but some of them have also pivoted into much more engineering specialisms as well. And it depends on the students. Some of them really like programming, so they're able to go in that direction. Others don't like that so much. So it's trying to offer a palette of skills to ensure that they can, carve out that career for themselves into the future, it's really important for us to be able to position them to do that.
Well, it sounds great, actually. I mean, it's someone, like, I feel like in marketing, we do have that type of people that is very polyphacetic, and that's what we need in the team. Someone that can, like, obviously they know about social marketing, but they can also build the web, but they also know about traditional marketing, external advertising, like they have to know a bit of everything. So
Yeah.
this that you're telling me is like the same, but in the language universe, and I think that's what you guys need. So I think it's amazing.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah.
So talking to you was amazing, but we are coming to the end. Is there anything else you would like to share with our audience today?
Well, just to go back to our original topic at the beginning around the crisis dimension, I want to show you a book that I've edited recently. Hopefully you can see that.
Oh yeah, can you put it a bit up, please?
So over here.
Yeah, perfect. That's perfect.
Okay, so this is Translating Crisis, which is edited with a colleague from UCL, Federico Federici. And in there are lots of chapters contributed by lots of people from academia, but also from the NGO sector on the role of translation and interpreting in crisis settings. Some of these are, from the front line experiences. So if anyone's interested in reading a bit more about that, that book is available from Amazon, I presume, published by Bloomsbury. So yeah, just to let you know that we're publishing stuff. And yeah,
that's great, because that was a really interesting topic. I can tell you I was at that presentation, and I think more people should basically specialize on those topics, because they are very important. We just spent a long time in a crisis, in a world crisis, but there is like smaller crisis going on in the world every single day, and we need people helping there. So I think that book can help many people. So thank you for letting us know.
And thank you for the opportunity to talk to you today, Maria. It's been great.
Yeah.
Thanks so much.
It was great having you. I wish we had more time because we could be talking for a long time.
We could.
So that's the end of today's show with Sharon O'Brien. Please make sure to tune in again to see or to listen to the next VistaTalks show, where we will be discussing more interesting topics with interesting people from all around the world.